two housekeeping announcements before we begin. Next week is this is the penultimate. Next week is the last session, November 1. Former Senator Richard Lugar, Howard Berman, Jane Harmon will be here to talk about, as well as hopefully some of the fellow alums who went through the first session, to talk about Congress's role in foreign policy. I was going to say, does Congress have a role in foreign policy? But we all know that, in fact, it does. And we need to talk about that. It'll be a fascinating session. And afterwards, I don't want to waste any more of the valuable speaker time. I want to talk to you about the Alumni Network, which we want to get all of you involved in. Let me just say that in each session, we're trying to drill down a little deeper, and it's obviously quite pretentious to assume that in such a short session we can, on a discrete or different area of the world. So it's now Latin America's turn. We'll do Africa, I think, in the spring, in April and May, when we run the third session of the program. And I can't imagine, and I say this, I mean, it has the virtue of being true, three better individuals to talk about this subject. And I'm going to turn it over. Cindy will first, then Duncan, then Eric, to try to do the impossible, which is to highlight priorities, interests, and connections between the United States and Latin America in 10 minutes each, 10 to 12 minutes each, and then hopefully we'll have ample time for questions and comments.
Great. Aaron, thanks, and thanks to all of you for your interest in this wonderful classroom opportunity here at the Wilson Center. I'm going to answer some of the questions that Eric posed to the three of us, which can be summed up as, why does Latin America matter? But first, I want to give you some basic a basic overview about the region, because I think that there's a fair amount that comes in the news, but sometimes people lack the big picture. So I'll start with a couple of major points. One is that the region itself, although we talk about Latin America, is a place of tremendous diversity. You have the small and vulnerable economies of Central America, as well as a country like Brazil with the world's 8th largest economy. You have open market economies and liberal representative democracies in countries like Mexico, Chile, Peru, Colombia. You have ALBA countries, the so-called ALBA countries, Venezuela, Ecuador, Bolivia. So it's very hard to kind of generalize, and I want to sort of say that at the outset, because I think that you have to talk much more specifically about subregions, and anytime people talk about Latin America in general, I think you should be immediately skeptical. There are also, differences as to whether or not countries have commodities, basic commodities like copper, oil, or whatever. A lot of that has driven the tremendous growth in the last decade. There have also been truly historic reductions in poverty over the last decade, some of it fueled by the growth because of the commodity boom. There have been some more minor reductions in inequality. Latin America still leads the world in inequality. And there has also been a really historic sea change in terms of the growth of the middle class. For the first time in the history of the region, there are now more people who are qualified as middle class than there are who are poor. Now, I want to immediately inject a caveat. There's a difference between people who earn, say, $10 a day and those who earn $4 a day. And indeed, the World Bank study that came out earlier this year, which has really set the discussion about the growth of the middle class, shows that, in fact, the largest segment of the population throughout the region are those who are considered vulnerable, the people who are one or two paychecks away from slipping back into poverty if someone gets sick, if the principal wage earner gets sick. So I want to make sure that that's understood. There are political implications of the reductions in poverty and the growth of the middle class. There are more demands, politically significant demands for access, not only access to basic services, but also for the quality of public services. And I think that this is one of the major explanations for the kinds of protests that we've seen over the last 2 years in a range of countries from Chile to Brazil to Colombia. The sense that people, need to take the bus. The buses don't run very well, and if you earn $4 a day, it matters to you if there's a 10-cent increase in the bus fare as opposed to someone of greater income. Another generalization, which I think is important, again with great variation, is that Latin America as a region has a homicide rate that is double the global average. As Eric will discuss later, the Northern Triangle of Central America, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, has the highest rates of homicide in the entire world. It's, most definitely a dubious distinction. So there are epidemic proportions there, much improved situation in countries such as Uruguay and Chile, but nonetheless, Latino Barometro, one of the main public opinion surveys in Latin America, will be releasing a report in about 2 or 3 weeks, which will show that concerns for crime and violence and citizen insecurity remains the #1 preoccupation of people. Now, why, given this sort of very telegraphic overview, why is it important? Well, an obvious reason is that it's close to the United States. In terms of shipping and whatever, it's a natural economic partner. There is a common interest, I think, in general about advancing democracy, advancing human rights throughout many countries, most countries in the region, core values of democracy and open markets, again, with the exceptions that I have mentioned. This is not a region, as in the Middle East, and I'm sure you've heard a lot about that, that is, riven with sectarian and religious and ethnic strife. There are certainly difficulties with indigenous populations and Afro-descendant populations as minority groups, but we're not looking at an area of the world that is just, where there's, people involved in massive killing of one another. In the most sort of crass economic sense, the United States is the largest single national investor in the region. A total of about 18% of foreign direct investment comes from the United States. The European Union as a whole has a higher percentage, but if you break that down by individual country, the U.S. is still the top investor. The United States is Latin America's largest trading partner, amounting to some $771 billion in trade. In 2011, I think we'll soon have the 2012 figures. The next closest trading partner after the United States is only about a third of that. And again, I'm talking about individual countries, not regions. And I think it would probably come as a bit of a surprise who are the top trading partners. The #1 trading partner is not a surprise, Duncan will talk about this, Mexico, which hands down is something like 7, 8, 9%, 9 times greater than anybody else. But following Mexico is Brazil, and #3, it'd be fun to do a pop quiz, #3 is actually Venezuela, because of the oil that is exported from Venezuela to the United States, and then followed by Colombia and Chile, but again, a fraction of what the trade is between the United States and Mexico. Latin America also matters for a lot of bad reasons. There is the continuing spread of organized crime. It was a decade ago a central concern in Colombia and in the Andean region, has spread to Mexico. I'm not going to get ahead of my colleagues here, but has spread to Mexico, Central America, with a huge threat to democratic governance, to human security, and the physical security of people that live in those areas. There are ways in which, obviously, U.S. drug consumption, the demand for drugs, as well as the flow of arms going south, has a major impact on the ability of violent drug cartels to operate and inflict their damage. This is also a region, and I think this goes to some of the core challenges for the United States. It's a region more and more that sees itself and understands itself as having multiple options for international insertion. China is, in fact, the largest export market for countries like Brazil, Chile, Peru. A number of other countries are close behind. Argentina, I think, also is in that list because of soy exports. So what do I want you to watch? In terms of developments in the next few months and issues that will come across the radar screen, not only of the executive branch, but potentially the Congress. One is the nosedive, really, in U.S.-Brazil relations as a result of the revelations of the spying by the NSA, the canceling of the state visit of President Dilma Rousseff just this month over the political fallout of that scandal. There are elections, both national and sub-region and subnational elections in about a half a dozen countries where there are going to be major, I think, political changes or implications. Coming up in November in Honduras, in Chile in December, Panama, El Salvador next year, Colombia next year, Brazil next year. Venezuela's regional elections take place, municipal elections take place in December, and all of these, I think, have the potential for changing the political landscape. There are also, I think, questions about how the United States is going to engage or not engage with Cuba. This is an issue that is of deep concern to certain constituencies on Capitol Hill as well as in the United States. And my own take on this is that the United States really remains kind of trapped in two different visions of how to deal with Cuba. One is a very Cold War vision that has been tried for 50 years, which is basically you squeeze them hard enough and the regime is going to collapse. I think that the evidence over the last decades shows that that's not the case, and if there ever were going to be a time when that vision would have potentially shown itself to be, valid or meaningful, would have been after the collapse of the Soviet Union. But Cuba has continued to diversify its economy, is now deeply integrated in the global economy. China is a major partner, as are a number of countries that the United States considers pariah regimes. And so the other vision is, I think, what the Obama administration has done, which is to tinker pretty much at the margins, not confront the Congress over revoking the embargo, but expand flights, people-to-people contact, remittances, that kind of thing. And I think the kind of blossoming of the informal economy and of small-scale production is really a reflection of the ability of people to have access to cash to start small businesses, restaurants, crafts, various forms of trade. I think I'm running out of my time, and there are a lot of other issues that I haven't touched on, which I think my colleagues will raise. What's happening with the immigration debate, which is, as we know, a domestic debate, but also one of deep concern to Mexico and Central America. We haven't touched on the peace process in Colombia and where that may lead or not lead. Welcome an opportunity to discuss. So thank you for your attention. Thanks again, Aaron.
Cindy, thank you so much. Duncan?
Yeah, thanks. Hi, everyone. How you doing? It's Friday afternoon. I'm sure you'd rather be here than in a bar somewhere. It is. It's very nice to see you all. That will come at some point. Great to see your eager faces. We've been given an incredibly difficult task. I can't believe that Cindy has covered the entire region in such a short period of time. It's really remarkable. I'm lucky. I'm one of the lucky directors here at the Wilson Center. I deal with one country. And still dealing with one country, I find it very difficult to keep up to date with everything that's happening here. Just as we were warming up here, Eric was telling me about something that he had been tracking, and it's like we kind of rely on each other to inform each other. I've been asked to explain to you sort of the basic question of why Mexico matters to the United States, factors that you can bring into your analysis of U.S. relations with the world. And you will have in front of you a publication which we produced earlier on this year, New Ideas for a New Era, which were policy recommendations that we put on the table for the new administration in Mexico of President Enrique Peña Nieto and for the second Obama administration. Give it a read through or just a flick through. It gives you some idea of where we are in the relationship and what the issues are that are coming up. And then I have a number of other publications here which I haven't distributed to everybody because they're probably not of interest to everybody. But there's one here which talks about Mexico as a middle-class society. It's one of the issues that I'm going to be talking about. These are all available outside if you want to take a copy. A second one here which is on the question of the border, the State of the Border report, which is going to become a biannual exercise here at the Wilson Center that will produce this book to give an update of what the state of play is at the border. And thirdly, a book that we produced this year called Mexico Matters, Why Mexico is Important for the United States of America. And that touches on many of the points that I'm actually going to be talking about here today with you. So I've divided my presentation into two parts. The first is long-term factors, which tell us why Mexico is important to the United States. And just as Cindy began, I'm going to begin with the question of geography. Robert Kaplan, of course, has produced that book recently called The Revenge of Geography, and it was a delight for those of us who studied international relations at university that finally we could go back to understanding maps as maps, that geographic distances do in fact matter, as opposed to the idea of the borderless world and an entirely globalized world. And this was something that was very, very important. And the interesting thing about Robert Kaplan's book is that he doesn't really talk about Mexico very much until the very end of the book, when he says, look, we spend all of these resources looking at the Middle East, looking at Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, etc. What about what's right next door to us? Surely that kind of geography really, really matters to us as well. And he says, let's look immediately south. And by immediately south, he means first of all Mexico, and then beyond that, Central America. And he says, you know, there are challenges, opportunities, and threats there. Maybe we should be devoting a lot more of our attention, a lot more of our resources to that region of the world. I think it's a very, very interesting perspective, and you can interpret this in two ways, depending on how you understand Robert Kaplan. One is to say, look, we need to adopt a similar attitude as we've adopted towards the Middle East to our immediate neighbors, which is kind of a defensive, kind of paranoid strategy, maybe. Or we say, look, it's not about what the threats are, it's about what threats and opportunities are in the world. And this is something where the United States benefits enormously from a relationship with its immediate neighbors. So the 2,000-mile border that Mexico and the United States share is one of the crucial elements in understanding the relationship between the two countries. And of course, that's the same with Canada. And I don't know, have they had a session on Canada yet?
They have not.
They have not. Well, you have to have a session on Canada, because as boring as Canada is, it matters just as much as Mexico, I would argue. This 2,000-mile border is, of course, impossible to close off. No matter how much rhetoric we hear here in Washington and around the country about sealing the border, that's a physical impossibility. And the classic example that people have with migration, you say, look, if you want to keep the migrants out, you build a higher wall. Well, what happens when you build a higher wall? People build longer ladders. And that's simply what happens with migration. Or they dig tunnels, or they go around the wall in some way. Being the southern flank of the United States is not just a question, though, of vulnerability. This is a question of opportunity. Having such a long land border means that it is possible to bring goods and services and people, talent in this case, into the United States through multiple entry points. It's also, of course, the bridge, the land bridge, from Central America and from South America. And we're seeing that increasingly today in the immigration debate. Mexico is also a source of considerable natural resources. We tend to focus on hydrocarbons, oil and gas, but we can look beyond that. Mexico has a huge mining industry. Mexico has a very, very important and growing renewable energy industry as well, which is something that we can talk about if we have time in the Q&A. Second long-term factor of why Mexico matters for the United States is the question of population and demographics. Mexico is a young country, and Mexico is a country which is growing, not as fast as it used to. The average fertility rate in Mexico per woman has gone down from 5 only 25 years ago to around 2 today. Now, this is an extraordinary change in terms of human fertility in Mexico. Education, healthcare, and rising income levels have helped this to change. But still, Mexico is a very, very young country, whereas the average age in the United States is 34, in Mexico is 24. That makes a big, big difference. When you add together the two countries and you're talking about where we're going in the future and where your young people are going to come from in the future to supply the labor market with the jobs that are needed to pay for all the services that we enjoy. It's not just that this is a relatively young country, but it's a country which has a rising middle class. And so I'll point you to that red book that's outside, Mexico, a middle class country, which means that not only is it important in terms of the number of people, the number of young people who are working there, but this is a country whose income levels are rising, which means that it's an increasingly important market for the United States. And I'll talk about that a little bit in a second. The process of democratization was a factor that I had completely left off of my my list of items to begin with, but I think it's a very, very important one. A lot of us tend to assume now that Mexico is a democratic country because they have elections, but this is very much a process of democratization which is ongoing, and there continue to be serious challenges to democratization and democracy in Mexico. Whether or not elections are fully free and fair, whether or not there are considerable biases built into the democratic institutions of the country. The fact that you see big, big differences between elections taking place at the federal level in Mexico and those taking place at the state and local level in terms of whether we can fully depend upon the outcomes being free and fair. Moving on to an economic factor which is crucial to understand about Mexico is how Mexico is an integral part, a central element in the integrated production process of North America. Now, that sounds like a very, very boring economic term, but it's in fact incredibly important. What this means is that if you look at sectors such as the automobile industry, if you look at sectors such as the aviation industry, or rather, sorry, the aerospace industry, you see that what products that are actually built here in the United States depend very, very heavily on parts and elements and labor that originate in Mexico, and vice versa, which means that you're looking at, in the case of a car that's sold in the North American market, it's crossed the borders of North America up to 9 times. That's a very, very important factor to work out here. It's important in understanding the competitiveness of products that are produced here in the United States, depending upon the inputs that come from Mexico and from Canada, but also in terms of understanding the importance of the border. The border is not just, again, I want to say this is not just a threat, a challenge, a weak point. This is an opportunity, and it's one that we have to focus our attention upon to make it much more efficient. We need to make sure it's secure, absolutely. But that has seemed to be the obsession in Washington for far too long. We also need to make sure that alongside security, and I will not underestimate the importance of that one, but alongside security, that it has to be efficient, because everybody benefits from this. If you have delays at the border for goods coming in from Mexico, it's not just impacting upon Mexico's foreign trade or its exports, it's impacting upon the integrated production process of North America. One of the statistics which have become popular to cite over the past 12 to 18 months is that if you look at exports coming into the United States from around the world, exports coming to the United States from China contain around 4% of value that originated in the United States when you look at the average of all of these imports from China. But imports coming into the United States from Mexico contain around 40% of value that originated in the United States. And that gives us an idea of the integrated production process in the region and the reason why Mexico's economy is so important to the United States, not just as an export market, but as a source of goods that matter to the United States. And basically that U.S. jobs depend upon this. A quick word on migration. I'll leave Eric to talk a little bit more about migration, or if not, we can do that in the Q&A. Just want to talk about the changing nature of migration. Mexico has been the target of a lot of anti-immigration frenzy over the years for obvious reasons. There are huge numbers of Mexicans that have moved northwards and crossed the border in a documented or undocumented fashion. What's fascinating to see right now is the changing nature of migration in terms of the numbers. We're looking at net zero migration between Mexico and the United States. In fact, we're seeing actually slightly more Mexicans going home at the moment than are coming to the United States. Part of this is voluntary. They're going back home because there are opportunities. They're going back home because things are tough here. They're going back home because they're retiring, issues like this. But the other one is, of course, massive deportations that are taking place as well. The other factor which is interesting here is that the Mexicans are rapidly being matched, of course, by the number of Central Americans who are coming up through Mexico and into the United States. And a third factor is the actual nature of the migrants themselves. We're seeing a change in the makeup of migration from Mexico to the United States. Increasingly, not just low-skilled or unskilled workers, but semi-skilled workers and skilled workers coming along. Now, of course, the low-skilled and unskilled workers still outnumber the semi-skilled and high-skilled workers, but it's a changing pattern which I think is important to recognize. The second half, I want to focus on the factors that are relevant today. These are the really contemporary factors that make us think that Mexico matters. And the first of these is something that Cindy mentioned, which is security. Mexico has been the target over the last 7 years of an enormous amount of attention here in Washington based upon its security situation. There's no better person in the world to talk about this than Eric, who's beside me, who has worked very, very heavily on security. But I'll just make a couple of comments here. The first thing is to say that despite the very, very real problem that Mexico faces in terms of public security and the problem of organized crime, there is a change that is underway. Doesn't mean that Mexico is now an entirely safe country to visit. It doesn't mean that Mexico doesn't have a problem, but it's a changing problem over time. We see flows, of course, in terms of the distribution of violence. We see changes in terms of who are the actors that are responsible for violence, and we're seeing changes in the type of violence and crime that exists in Mexico. And perhaps the best example of this is what's happened over the past 12 months, that we've seen quite a large drop, somewhere between 15 and 18% in the homicide rate in Mexico. But what we have seen is that other crimes have picked up dramatically. Kidnapping, for example, car theft, and burglary of homes. These are issues which are very real problems for the government of Mexico at the federal level and at the state level. What we're seeing is that some regions of the country have been much better to deal with this changing threat over time than others. And we have to recognize that some parts of the country, for example, Tamaulipas as a state up in the northeast, Guerrero, a state down in the southwest, Michoacan, a state right next door, have been really severely plagued by the problems of violence, and the government is still trying to get a handle on that. But then we have to come to the reality, which is that despite the dangers that exist in Mexico, Mexico City, the DF, the Distrito Federal, is a safer city to live in than Washington, D.C., in terms of the homicide rate. I mean, that's one thing it's an argument that I have constantly with people on planes who tell me, how could you possibly have lived in Mexico City? Isn't it incredibly dangerous? And I say, it's actually a very, very safe city. You don't go to certain areas of town, but that's true of any big city in the world. And you have to learn basically what the code is there. But once you know that, you can get by. In terms of looking at Mexico as a whole, the homicide rate in Mexico is one of the lowest of all of the Latin American countries. But you have these hotspots around the country where it is, in fact, very, very dangerous. Of course, we couldn't ignore the fact of U.S.-Mexico collaboration on questions of security that's taken place, the Merida Initiative, which everybody talks about as being a huge foreign security aid program, between $1.6, $1.9 billion that have been spent on this. And people agonize about what the future of this is because the current government in Mexico doesn't seem to be quite so enthusiastic about it as the previous government was. Well, Merida and the security collaboration between the two countries is changing, and at the very end of my talk, I'll talk about some of the factors which are really impacting upon that today. The present day, moving away from security, a present day factor which is crucial to understand is competitiveness. The fact that we have to understand Mexico as a central component of North American and US competitiveness. I've talked about integrated production already, but thinking long term about guaranteeing low cost energy for the region, and making sure that you have high-quality human resources, and making sure that you have a regional manufacturing export platform, which is crucial if we're going to be able to compete as a country and as a region in a globalized world where we're increasingly looking like economic regions. Another contemporary factor which we cannot ignore is the very ambitious reform agenda which is underway in Mexico right now. The current president of Mexico, Enrique Peña Nieto, has put in place a series of major reforms from labor through education, through telecoms, through financial, through energy, fiscal, and political reforms, which make Mexico one of the most exciting countries in the world to study right now because of the progress that is being made and understanding the political dynamics that explain why that is possible and why, in fact, the government's running into a few problems at the moment. But the reform agenda in Mexico, perhaps from the United States point of view, is most important in terms of what's happening in the energy sector. After 75 years of having a closed energy sector where the national oil company Pemex has had a monopoly over hydrocarbons exploitation, now we're seeing a move towards an opening, a partial opening of that system, but where private and foreign firms will be able to compete alongside Pemex, the national oil company, for exploration and production contracts in the Gulf of Mexico and onshore. Lastly, Mexico's economic growth potential. This is where I think it's most exciting. It brings in all of these factors that I've talked about. Mexico's labor costs are in fact now on a par or even slightly lower than China's when you factor in all the different things. Given the fact that it's so close, it makes a lot of sense now to produce goods in Mexico for the US market rather than producing them in China, where you have to get them across that massive Pacific Ocean. And when you think about the cost of transportation, in particular how high diesel fuel and fuel oil has got in recent years, you look at the cost and the time of moving goods. A great comparison is shipping a container from Shanghai to Chicago takes around 3 weeks and takes around $3,000 per container. Okay? To get a container from Monterrey up to Chicago costs around $2,600, but it takes 3 to 4 days. If you're dealing with just-in-time production and an integrated production process, that really does matter. That's of huge importance to business people. Mexico has more foreign trade agreements than any other country in the world, which means that it is an incredibly liberal country in terms of its trading relations. It benefits from the presence of important clusters in the manufacturing industry and in the aerospace industry. Its energy costs are not amongst the lowest in the world at the moment, but they're rapidly moving towards that with the energy reform which is coming and with the construction of important infrastructure, bringing low-cost natural gas from the United States of America. And lastly, where are we in the bilateral relationship? In the bilateral relationship today, we see a very, very healthy relationship on economic terms, as I've indicated, but the political and security relationship between the two countries is really quite complicated. Whereas we look back on the presidency of Felipe Calderon between 2006 and 2012 as being really the high point of U.S.-Mexico security cooperation with the Merida Initiative, etc., we've seen significant frictions emerge in the relationship at the current time. And one of the reasons why I'm actually not very optimistic about that security relationship at this point in time is that despite all of the effort that has taken place from within certain segments of the Mexican government and within the U.S. government to try to convince those elements of the Mexican government that don't want to have a close relationship that this should be a positive thing, the recent revelations from the NSA are really, really damaging. It's just another reason why certain very important people who are in the Interior Ministry and in the security agencies say, look, we can't trust the United States of America and we shouldn't work with them. And that's why I think, despite the fact that Mexico's reaction to the NSA scandal has been very moderate, we should still be worried about it, because it's convincing people inside the government that they were right all along and that you simply cannot trust the United States of America. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Duncan, thank you. Eric?
Great. Thank you. I don't know if this is on. I can talk loud. I'm going to just touch on two issues quickly, one being Central America and the other being hemispheric drug policy. Central America, why is it important? At some level, you could say, really, who cares? You know, it's a region that includes 8 countries, tiny countries, total population of around 43 million, small economies, a great deal of poverty. 2 of the 3 poorest countries in the hemisphere are in Central America. There's markets there, obviously, but not the kind of markets that are represented by Mexico or Brazil or many other countries of the region. So at some level, why is Central America important? I think the answer is a theme that's come up repeatedly, and that's proximity. The U.S. has traditionally defined not only Mexico and its 2,000-mile border and 113 million people now as an important national security issue, but has also included Central America. And I was thinking back even to the days of Ronald Reagan, when I'm sure most of you weren't even born yet, but remembering how Ronald Reagan defined Central America and the importance of it in the midst of the Cold War as being one of proximity. They're on our doorstep. And so there's always been this sense that even though they're small and poor and at some level maybe not significant in the grand scheme of things, it's vitally important to our national security and our national interests to ensure that there's stability in those countries of Central America, just like it is in Mexico. They're within our sphere of influence, if you will. And so as a result, Mexico and Central America have seen direct U.S. intervention on many occasions. Most recently, in the Panama intervention in 1990, 89, and in Grenada before that during the Reagan presidency. So there's always been this sense, even though poor, weak, they're a matter of great concern to the United States and our security. And I would add to that the fact, we have made in the United States the border safety and security policy between U.S. and Mexico as a top priority. I can say that we are increasingly looking at border safety and security between Mexico and Guatemala and the other Central American countries as equally important. Maybe not in size, but a sense that if there's not control and security on those borders, they could represent a threat to the United States, just like the U.S.-Mexico border. I was just at the Guatemala and Mexican border in the south, and it's very clear the U.S. is concerned about the lack of control there. Now, there are other issues that raise it in importance. One is obviously the issue of migration. There are a large number of Central Americans in this country, many of them here as a result of the conflicts in the 1980s. But we see that while those conflicts are over and the migration went down, it is now beginning to return quite significantly. So I looked at some of the numbers, and let me just throw this out there. Between 2003 and 2011, apprehensions of Guatemalans in the United States went up 278% during that period of time. Salvadorans, it went up 117%, and Hondurans went up 75%. During that same period, the apprehension of Mexicans in the United States actually went down 48%. So as Duncan was saying, we've seen a steady sort of decline, maybe more rapid in the U.S. economic downturn of Mexicans, but you're seeing a dramatic increase in the number of Central Americans. They still don't add up to the number of Mexicans being apprehended, but the numbers are, the trend lines are beginning to cross. Now, what does that mean? That means that there's a lot of familial ties between the United States and Central America. Some of it's good, some of it's not so good. A big problem in Central America are the Central American gangs. Most of those gangs were founded and began in Los Angeles and parts of California, and in the deportation process, and ended up deporting gang members to Salvador and Central America, and they grew there. So some of that migratory relationship is good, some of it not so great. Also many economic ties through remittances, people coming to the United States, working here, sending tremendous amounts of money back to Central America. It's one of the main sources of foreign currency for the countries of Central America. And that's a good thing in many ways to buoy those economies, but it also has some downsides. It also becomes then a source of, or an easier way, I should say, for laundering illegal proceeds of drugs sold in the United States become mixed in with the remittances process, and they are getting laundered back to Central America, Mexico, and elsewhere. Two of the economies of Central America are now dollarized economies. El Salvador and Panama. Panama has its own currency, but the currencies are interchangeable. So that too makes things very close. The other part of the other concern, of course, is that as Central America has struggled economically, the strength, the power of organized crime and drug trafficking has increased dramatically. I don't share the view that this is a new phenomenon in Central America. Drugs have been coming through Central America for decades. I was living in Honduras when a Honduran drug kingpin was snatched off the street in 1987 and taken to the United States. And the popular reaction to this was to burn down the U.S. Embassy in Tegucigalpa. So this has been going on for a long time, but there's a difference now. They have what I would call state capture. They have not just engaged in trafficking, but increasingly gained control of the institutions of government, penetrating police, military, justice systems, you name it, and gained much more control of the state apparatus in Central America than ever before. And in the process of increased trafficking, there's also been increased violence. And this gets us back to this issue that Cindy raised. Central America, and particularly the northern triangle countries of Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala, are now together the most violent area in the world that's not at war. Honduras has the highest homicide rate, over 90 per 100,000. And just for a point of reference, Mexico's homicide rate is a little over 20 per 100,000. So you get a magnitude of almost 4 times, or more than 4 times in Honduras. And Guatemala and El Salvador also very high levels of homicide. Now, interestingly enough, while there has been so much focus on cutting back budgets and making budgets more, targeted and having better impact, and people have felt the squeeze on budgets. The one area of the hemisphere that's actually gone in the other direction has been Central America. And budgets for police and military grant aid through the State Department have actually increased since 2009. The economic support funds and social investment funds that the U.S. supports through AID and other programs have also increased. It's the one area where we've seen an increase, and we've seen pretty significant cutbacks in Colombia and Mexico over the last couple of years. So that's another indication of the importance that the U.S. gives to it. Let me just say a word about drug policy. It may not be registering on your radar screens in Congress, but there is a pretty interesting debate going on in the hemisphere around drug policy. Traditionally, drug policy has been governed by some international conventions and been focused on the issue primarily of eradication of drug crops, coca, marijuana, etc., and interdiction of traffickers. That's been the traditional framework of U.S. policy. That's kind of the framework of the international conventions. And by and large, Latin America has followed along in that process. But increasingly, over the last 3-4 years, there have been growing voices from the region saying this isn't good enough, that we've been doing this, I'm channeling them, if you will, but you hear voices saying, we in Latin America have been following this prescription from the United States and the international community for the last 20 years, and rather than seeing less drug trafficking and less drug production, we see more powerful organized crime, and the thing that really bothers the region more than anything is more violence, more homicides. I'm not justifying this, but you hear presidents and leaders in the region say, we are sacrificing our children to stop drug trafficking and to stop the drugs that you in the United States are consuming. Why should we continue to do this if the problem is really in the U.S. as the major consumer market of drugs? Now, that has led presidents in the region to call for a rethinking of the drug policy framework for the region, to begin to open up discussions of, instead of a law enforcement and eradication approach, a public health approach to the problems of drugs. Latin America traditionally has not been a region of consumption, but are increasingly consumers, not at the level of the United States, but we do see countries that are increasingly middle class, like Brazil, Argentina, Chile, see their consumption of cocaine go up as well. So there's an interest on the part of some in the region, and I don't want to overgeneralize, but some of the presidents of the region to try to look for new frameworks to understanding drugs and drug policy. And I think as the United States goes through a process of rethinking its own domestic drug policy, it's also lending momentum to people in the region. They point to Colorado and Washington as states that have legalized. If the U.S. can legalize, why should we be, again, sacrificing our sons and daughters for a drug that you're legalizing? Maybe we should think about legalization. In one country, Uruguay is taking that quite seriously and is close to being the first country in the world to legalize and regulate the cannabis market. Other cities like Mexico City are looking at similarly, so there's a growing sense of that. Again, this issue of public health, as the U.S. has begun to shift slowly from a policy of incarceration, of law enforcement, and opening more avenues to mental health, substance abuse treatment, those sorts of things. People in the region are saying maybe we should be doing the same. and trying to push back a bit from on the United States. The most significant development here has been a process at the Organization of American States of developing a series of studies and scenarios that is leading the countries of the region, including the United States, in a discussion about drug policy and how it might reform. The OAS has not laid out a pathway. They don't have a goal in mind, but there is momentum behind the idea of we need to rethink what we've been doing for the last 20 to 30 years because it ain't working, and we're paying a heavy price. So just, I think that gives a bit of context of what's going on in the region.
Eric, thanks. So I have questions, but I'll hold them in the interest of yours. Cindy, you have a few minutes to be
I have
with
a
us.
couple minutes, but I have to.
Okay, so, questions? Comments? Yes, please identify yourself as,
Megan Swanton with Congress Before Architects. Y'all mentioned reforms that the new Peña-Nieto administration is advancing, but how do you see them progressing with the judicial reform that the Calderon administration initiated? Do you see that they would make their 2016 deadline, and is it important for Mexico to move forward with that?
Can I begin and you
Yeah,
jump in? on
sure.
it? Do you want to answer them question by question, or do you want to take?
yeah, well, actually, maybe if there's one for Cindy on the broad, we can get,
Yeah.
you guys can stay for a while.
Yeah.
Yeah, 'cause I have to go.
Yes,
I'll think of an answer.